would like to start the next session, which is titled, which is focusing on the SDG number 17, Revitalize the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. So if you would kindly take your seats, please, and so we can start the session to make up for the time. We're running a little bit late already, so yeah, I'm just starting. We've heard a lot about the importance of public-private partnerships in the UN environment in our last session, and I'm happy to connect and grab this topic again now in the session that is following. So please allow me to briefly introduce our session. According to the United Nations, the SDG number 17 emphasizes the urgency of effective partnerships between governments, the private sector, and civil society as a condition for successful, sustainable development. These partnerships are considered to be the basis to unlock private long-term investment, which is needed in critical sectors such as energy, transport, infrastructure, or health, especially in developing countries, to achieve the SDGs. In an ideal situation, these partnerships are inclusive. They are built on common principles and include regulations as well as incentive structures that attract private investments into the public sector. In an ideal situation, they are also designed to share risks and benefits between the public and the private sector adequately, to comprise efficient review and monitoring frameworks that ensure a successful project implementation and long-term operation. So, to make it short, public-private partnerships can be considered as vehicles to mitigate project risks, to enhance private investment in the public sector, and to increase project and cost efficiency. But what is a PPP? So, the ideas of what a public-private partnership is are really different. So I will give a brief definition according to the World Bank as a basis for this session, and I hope my speakers will agree to that definition. The World Bank defines a PPP as a long-term contract between a private party and a government agency for providing a public asset or service in which the private party bears significant risk and management responsibility. So, despite these more formal considerations, the real-life track record of public-private partnerships is very mixed in developing as well as developed countries. And the general debate about advantages and disadvantages of PPPs, as well as the optimal framework for PPPs, is still ongoing, as we could just see with regard to the UN system. So this session now is focused on the questions of how PPPs can contribute to achieving the SDGs, how PPP frameworks should ideally be designed to ensure effective project implementation, and how the sharing of risks and benefits can be equally balanced between the public and the private sector. So we are very happy to welcome our five distinguished speakers. There are already 4 here at the moment, so we're still waiting for Huangming Wang. I hope you will be joining us shortly. And our speakers will present very different perspectives on PPP frameworks today, as well as suggestions how these frameworks could be improved, and will present learning lessons from very different parts of the globe. So a formal remark before we start: we have a brief question and answer session after each presentation, and I hope we'll have a lively discussion at the end of the session. So I'm very glad now to start the session with our first talk. It's more a talk than a presentation, which is titled PPPs in History, Theory and Practice by Dr. Bhabani Shankar Nayak from Coventry University in the UK. Bhabani is critically evaluating both normative and empirical arguments within existing literature on PPPs. He argues that the critical success of PPPs depends on its social value for the common good. So that's a very good basis, I think, for a final discussion. Bhabani is a political economist who works on the political economy of development, religion, market, social business, and sustainability. So Bhabani, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here. Good to see so many colleagues talking about one of the significant issues of 20th century and 21st century together. I'm thankful to United Nations Joint Inspection Unit and World Association for Sustainable Development, particularly Professor Mahmood for organizing such an exciting conference. In my talk, I'll be talking about, I'm not going to talk about the concept of PPP. I'll talk a bit about the history of PPP. Why should we talk about the history of PPP? It's important to locate both the ontological and epistemological foundation of the public policy. Most of the time, we forget that there is a world outside Europe. Most of the time, we forget there are people outside European Union. And we need to dismantle this Eurocentric approach to public policy, particularly when we locate the issues within and outside public-private partnerships. So therefore, history is important to put the record straight where we can debate PPP, whether it's an alternative policy approach or it can be implemented or not. So if you locate the history of PPP till today, we see that indigenous communities in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, they manage community resources. They construct public infrastructure. Indigenous communities continue to do so till today, as we speak. We never consider them as a public policy intervention. These are their way of life. But if you locate history of public-private partnership in Europe, it can be traced back to Roman Empire. The postal networks, highway systems were developed in Roman Empire 2,000 years ago in Europe by following the principles of public-private partnerships. The construction of fortified towns and villages in southwestern region of France during 12th and 13th century was another example in the success story in the history of use of public-private partnerships. The further expansion of public works, concession programs in canal construction, roads, public distribution system, transportation system was developed within the help of public-private partnerships in France during 16th and 17th centuries. During 6th century, the Muslim traders in the Malabar district of Kerala, Kerala is a state in south of India, the Muslim traders in the Malabar district of Kerala in south of India provided resources to the Buddhist missionaries to carry out public works, particularly establishing health centers, educational centers for public good. So the kind of debate we hear for last 2 days, we think that public-private partnership is an alternative which can solve all the issues of sustainability. It is an alternative to the issues of development we face today, not just in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, we face today inside Europe. Majority of people are suffering, and a minority, the people, those who control the resources, the minority of population, maybe 1% of world population control the resources, those who enjoy the privileges of the state and the government. So therefore, it's important to locate the history of public-private partnership, not just within Europe, but outside Europe as well. So this history is completely forgotten. There is a neoliberal assault on history. The teaching of history is something considered to be less profitable in the market of higher education. Therefore, when we listen about public-private partnership as a policy framework, we think that it started during 1980s or during 1990s after the Washington Consensus. So there's a reversal in the trend within public-private partnership. We see as if there is a growth of third-party welfare state under the leadership of business and corporations. I must give a footnote that I'm not opposed to the markets. I'm not opposed to the corporations. But the market that separates consumers from the producers, the market that creates imbalance in the society, the market that dismantles the social solidarity, caring and sharing economy, we must oppose that kind of market. We need market that brings people together. We need market that brings producers and consumers together. I don't want, like, if we really give our own examples, I did not know who produced my breakfast. I don't know who produced my T-shirt, my pants and shirts and my mobile phone. What are the wages they get? So we cannot think about sustainability if we don't know who produces what, when, and how. This takes me to the debate during 1917 when Harold J. Lusky published his book called The Grammar of Politics. He raised an important question called who gets what, when, and how. This is where the politics matters in the public policies. And this politics cannot flow from the Europe. It should flow from the bottom up. It should flow from the rural communities, those who live with it and die with it. So therefore, when we talk about public-private partnerships, we should reject the Scottish political economy founded by Adam Smith. The Smithian philosophy of new public management provides both theoretical and conceptual foundation to the public-private partnerships around the world by looking at businesses as agents and state as the principal agent. It takes me to the issue of public-private partnership during colonialism. The British state stood behind East India Company for the colonization of Asia and Africa. So similarly, the French state stood behind French corporations for French colonialism. So therefore, when we talk about public-private partnership, we should remember history, that how state supported private corporations to exploit the rest of the world outside Europe. So therefore, we need to reject the functionalist and essentialist approach towards public-private partnership by looking at history and locate public-private partnership as an alternative which can bring people together by managing resources in a sustainable way for long-term future. We cannot follow the strategic management literature that locates public partnership as a risk reduction strategy of investment with long-term returns. We cannot use state as an observer of shock and you socialize the risk, privatize the profit by following the private-public partnership. So what should we do? What kind of direction global public policy should take within the context of the issues of sustainability and public-private partnership? I think we need to reject the idea of privatizing the profit and consolidate in the hands of few and try to exploit the state and resources as much as possible. This is not sustainable. You cannot have an island of pleasure and the world of miseries. So therefore, it is important to locate PPP beyond cost-benefit analysis. We have to locate public-private partnership beyond the ideas, theories, and practices that comes from the Eurocentric ideology. We need to really move away from all these market-based debates. When I say market-based debate, we should not really locate the current market as an alternative. We have to see how market can bring people together. I don't want to give the market spaces to the corporations. Market is a social institution. It's a product of people, it's a product of the society. Therefore, the society should control the market. But unfortunately, all of us, those of us we are talking, or those of us who are living in this world, we are being controlled by the market, which is not sustainable. And the public-private partnership that promotes such a model, such an idea, is not sustainable. So therefore, public-private partnership should focus on human development, human welfare, by looking at the idea of socializing profit and privatizing the risk in terms of community risks. Risk can be managed by the communities, and the profit can be owned by the communities. That is the only way we can think about reflect on public-private partnerships. If the public-private partnerships all about managing and privatizing the profit and socializing the risk, we remain in the same danger as we have seen in the world today. So what should be the role of business and market forces? I think I look at business and market forces as social interactions. I don't look at market as just economic interaction. So we need to bring back the social character of business. We need to bring back the social character of market by which the producers will know the value of their product and the consumers will know the price of their product. Unfortunately, we live in a world where the consumers don't know the price of their product and the producers don't know the value of their product. So we live in a blind market and we name them as free market economy. Such a model, such a development agenda for sustainability is impossible. Therefore, we need to look back the history to locate community ownership over the resources for a sustainable future. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bhabani, for these very compelling remarks, which I think are a good basis for thinking about frameworks of public-private partnerships in the future that take the common good into consideration, that look at the history of these constructs and are not only focused on market-based approaches. So thank you very much. Yes. Any questions? We have 1 minute for some brief questions to Bhabani. Without starting, yes, please. Yes, sir, behind the United States.
He's from Sudan.
Yes, yeah. Yes. Oh,
you,
Thank you very much. I mean, I had been promoting this place, you know, from Sudan to UK, now to United States. I think that's promotion in my career, which is good. I haven't got there yet, but perhaps one day. Anyway, I have a question, but I'm not sure about the 1 minute answer to it, because you have actually, you know, stated very good history for, you know, the PPP and how it developed from history. Obviously, we have deviated from that at a certain point in time. When, why, and how we deviated so that we can actually bring it back to where it was? I hope it can be a short answer.
The short answer is from 1980s onwards, with the growth of neoliberalism as only model of development, as only model of economic philosophy that led to the growth of such a desperate situation. We can discuss after the conference more in detail. Thank you.
Thank you. Very elaborate history on PPP. Can I ask about the role of corporate social responsibility? We know that the corporate social responsibility is well embedded in developed countries. Do you have any ideas on how it is or how it can be embedded in developing countries?
Thank you. It's a very difficult question, but a very brief answer. Corporate social responsibility is a marketing strategy of the corporations to exploit natural resources and expect that the local communities, indigenous communities, will not resist the exploitation of natural resources. I'll give you a classic example of Vedant Corporation, which is registered in London. It exploits bauxite mines. It does bauxite mining in the eastern India, in South India, dismantling the natural habitat and natural resources of indigenous communities. So my approach is, make them, if you buy a share of Vedant, you are a shareholder. Why the indigenous communities are not shareholders of the resources on which they sit? So I don't need corporate social responsibility from Vedant to set up health centers. I want all the resources. There should be partnership between Vedant and the indigenous communities. Let the profit be shared between the indigenous communities and the corporations. That would be a better alternative than investing a tiny bit of bit of money out of the profit of the corporations on corporate social responsibility. That would be my response. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhabani, and I'm sure there will be a lot of more questions at the end of the session, so I hope we find time to discuss them. I'm now very happy to introduce Professor Ronald McQuaid from the University of Stirling in the UK, who will present on public-private partnerships and services, so we shift a little bit more to a specific area here. Ronald is arguing that services-only PPPs have very different drivers than more traditional infrastructure PPPs, and that we need to give more consideration to the consequences of using PPPs to provide services. Ronald.
Right, thank you very much. Much of my interest in PPPs has actually been more in public, private and non-NGO joint working and collaboration. But today I want to restrict it really down to contractual-based ones, which are more consistent with the World Bank and other definitions. Just get this. Okay, so we've only got about another 33 minutes before lunch, so I'll try to maybe skip a few slides if you don't mind. So as in the introduction was said, looking at the consequences of using PPPs, because I think too often we look at what are the upfront, these are the reasons for using them, but we don't actually look at the wider implications that they have for things like the social development goals, etc. So some reasons for the rise of service-based PPPs. We've got the traditional new public management, the move from the perception from public as a provider of services to an enabler of services, where they collect the funding for it, they pay for the services, they set out a specification for it, they ensure the protection of the users of the service, but they do not necessarily provide it themselves. So that whole philosophical background, and again, lots of people have written about PPPs and new public management in the past. Big reasons for infrastructure PPPs are budget enlargement. And I used to have arguments with people saying, no, it's all about efficiency. But I think the proof is in the pudding in a way. As soon as when the international accounting standards changed and PPPs more and more brought on balance sheet, in other words, the government showed them as expenditure in the current year rather than hiding them, what's happened in places like the UK, the number of PPPs has actually, I think, gone down relatively quite considerably. I think also the interest in the new rules for the PFI2, again, they've suddenly changed how they account for capital, so it's spread out over the life of the project, just like an ordinary public expenditure, capital expenditure in a way, rather than being upfront, which again, you think, well, what effect does that have? And amazingly, it also counteracts the budget enlargement influences. Another thing about PPPs was the apparent tax burden, where you could get fiscal illusion, where in the early days, if PPPs are more efficient, which hopefully most would be, then they would decrease the long-term expenditure/tax GDP ratio. However, if they're less efficient, which I would think some of the early, particularly the early post-1980s PFI-type PPPs, if they're less efficient than other sources because of funding, etc., then they actually raise the tax burden over the lifetime of the project. But these reasons don't really apply to services, because most of the services PPPs will be in current expenditure. So I don't think these are the same motivations for services as you would have for traditional infrastructure in some countries. So moving on to the more traditional reasons then for PPPs, it's about improving the efficiency and effectiveness, because you're bringing in the disciplines, incentives, skills and expertise of the private sector and releasing the so-called potential of the public sector. Very, very old. But the same argument is consistently being brought forward. There's a large push in places like China, East Asia, etc., on PPPs. And again, similar arguments have been brought through. And if this is correct, then it'd be very hard to be against it, no matter what your stance was, because it's going to be allow more services to be provided for the same cost, or the same services to be provided at lower cost. So efficiency and effectiveness are hard to argue against. But there's also been a move towards outcome-based policy, again, rather than being concerned about providing the provider enabler. Outcome-based, from historically, we would look at how much do you spend on clean water? X million. That's good. You double the amount, you've doubled the effect on clean water. Well, have you? Then the output measures, how many kilometres or metres of water pipe have we put in, towards more outcome-based policy, which is really how many people have got clean, sustainable water in their houses, or whatever the outcome you're really interested in, and less concerned with these other measures. So I think this move towards more outcome-based policy in some countries, some places, is again a push towards some market PPPs. Another reason is simply the search for markets. So companies will go to foreign countries, other countries, exporting to expand their market, but often the big market is actually in their domestic backyard. So there's a big pressure for companies saying there's a huge market here of 30–40% of the GDP. How much of that can be brought back and made available in a way for public companies? And the last two are other issues, I think, some forces for PPPs. And I should say, as a general supporter of PPPs, I must say, but I do think we need to look at both sides. You can never get a one-handed economist because they always fall over, because they always say, on the one hand is this, on the other hand is that. So if you're tied one hand behind, they'll automatically fall over. So I do think we need to really more clearly look at the pros and cons of PPPs rather than just looking at these perceived advantages. So looking at changing the nature of service provision and personalization in a little bit more depth, there's a rise in recognition of the complexity of issues. Even somebody looking for a job, what affects them? It's housing, healthcare, childcare, local job demand, social networks, etc. Most issues are quite complex. Can a single agency actually deal with the complex issues that are faced in society? And that's a big problem. So a single agency in a government cannot do it. So therefore, how do they work in partnership with others, and others who may be non-public, NGOs or private, who may be better equipped to provide these services jointly? Secondly, there's maybe multi-dimensional disadvantage requires multi-agency and or multi-service responses. And again, how do we best coordinate and collaborate? And are PPPs the best way forward? And the argument I'd make here is sometimes service-based PPPs are the best, but other times they're not necessarily the best. And we'll come on to some of the reasons why shortly. Another thing is that many welfare services are concentrated in the most disadvantaged groups or areas. And the problem with a contractual PPP is often it's fairly rigid. And secondly, so you cannot respond to changing needs very easily or very quickly. And secondly, I think a big danger is that PPPs are organized organization to organization. And yet, one of the fundamental pillars of SDG, social development, sustainable development goals, is the social pillar. And social pillar involves local people being involved in the development of services, etc. And the danger is that we have organization to organization, and in effect, they cut out the main part of the users because they're concerned with legal jargon, legal agreements, etc., and they do not actually pull on board the views adequately of local people and local users. And there are other things like persistent demands, which demographics, which affects most of the world, except currently sub-Saharan Africa and the Gulf, perhaps. But most of the rest of the world is aging. But I'll skip the next couple of slides because of time. So the next thing was, we'd say, personalization of PPP and PPPs. Personalization, again, is, I think, something that does influence sustainable development goals and also policies. But I've taken an old policy here. Personalization means that people are getting individualized policy support. So it's not one size fits all. It's very much what are the needs of individuals or groups, and how do we actually better deliver that? And that means people are more involved in how services are designed. A bit like Amartya Sen's capability approach. You need to give people voice when they actually ask what types of services are provided. It's what do people actually value, not necessarily what an organization thinks that they value. So we need to get people involved in how services are designed and how people receive support that's most suitable for them. And we need to balance this against other factors such as effectiveness and efficiency, etc. We also have to help people and professionals to work together to manage the risks and resources. And how do you get people-centered services which change when people or the needs change? And that, again, there are problems here with service-based PPPs if they are long life ones. Over 7 years is a lifetime. Somebody entering school age 5, they'll have finished primary school by the time the PPP finishes. So we're talking about even a 7-year PPP is often too long. But if we take a legalistic approach to PPPs, that is what we will reduce the flexibility. So, well, I was going to say about do we need good evaluation and monitoring of PPPs to ensure that we can distinguish the bull from the substance, but we're also going to say, well, how do you personalize the service for such in such an area? Now, the problems, 2 minutes, okay. So, some of the problems, well-known problems, written about lots of times. PPPs can force people to maintain services and infrastructure, but locks them into a particular type of provision. Where is this about responsiveness to community need? May tie into inappropriate technology. We've talked about, 5G is coming in 2020. That's 2 years from now. You have a PPP today. How do you actually allow that to give you a flexibility of different types of services provided in different ways that will arise from G20, G5 throughout the globe, including in places like Africa and elsewhere. I'm just using 3G, but the same thing with the mobile phone. And in fact, some of the schools in early UK PPPs did not have internet in the contracts at all. And this happens, technology continually changes. We may cause cuts in other services. You have to maintain your legal obligation to PPP. So therefore, what do you cut? You cut whatever you don't legally have to oblige. They may also influence other policies, which I won't go into at the moment. So basically, there are a number of other problems, transaction costs, etc. But there are many key success factors. Clear, agreed strategy, transparency, rigorous monitoring evaluation, and the building of trust. And do we build trust best through a legal system of PPPs or not? In some cases, the answer is yes. In fact, in a small local community, you may often find where people, if they fall out, that falling out, that disagreement will continue for many years or decades in the future. And in those cases, maybe a strict legal definition where we all agree that we've met the legal definition is better than a more informal one where people can actually have misunderstandings and then fall out and reduce trust in the future. But there may be organisation complementarity in organisations, so how do you actually operate PPPs on the ground? And particularly when you get local communities, maybe local NGOs, etc., may be the ones that are able to take into account the local circumstances better and be more flexible. And how do we get that if we have a more legalistic type PPP? Now, the last slide then before I'm completely stopped. We need to think of PPP, service PPPs, as a series of balances, as a quality of service. Very hard to measure quality of service versus efficiency. You can cut the cost of a service, but what if the quality reduces? Efficiencies, are they achieved by actual improvement, working better, working smarter, or by cuts in wages and conditions, in which case I would call that an illusion of efficiency. All you've done is reduced labour conditions. Also, we've noticed, big drop in trade union influence. Biggest area of trade unions, of course, is the public sector, and PPPs in services will have an influence on trade union as one of the social partners' influence. Economies of scope, scale versus diseconomies. But innovation is maybe the last one. Even restricted use to protect users. So what often happens is you put into restrictions to the PPP, which in effect means they are not as innovative as they could be, because even a black box approach, taken one example from the UK of the work programme, actually contained so many restrictions that actually it inhibited innovation. But at the same time, if you put out PPPs that are large-scale ones, and I would say, again, UK work programme where only multinationals could really apply for it, large-scale companies, you've got monopoly power, and again, you inhibit innovation then. And lastly, coordination then. How is the best to get coordination for the difficult problems that face people? How do we get involvement of social partners so we get responsive services? And is intra-PPP coordination the most effective way, or are there other ways of PPP where you can get better intra-organizational coordination? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ronald. That I really like that thought about the complexity of PPPs, which requires a cooperation not only between the public and the private sector, but also by including civil society organization, as well as asking the recipients of these services as well. And I think there are some approaches of that, but that would also help in terms of deciding what is actually efficiency. Is it just cost reduction or is it quality improvement? So very interesting elaboration. I think we have time for 2 brief questions. Yes, please.
Very enlightening presentation. Can I ask about the public-private partnership in relation to health? Any efficiencies, effectiveness, does it work?
I think it depends very much on the PPP, and it depends on whether you're talking about the full infrastructure and hospitals, services, etc. And there are pros and cons. And in fact, I was talking to somebody, a doctor in a UK hospital in a PPP one, which opened last December, who's already noting some of the problems because the users, which in that case means medical practitioners as well as the patients, were not properly consulted. And the result now is that they have a slightly inadequate building for the next 20 years, which is how long the contract goes. The thing about things like medicine is, as the way you provide services change, does a PPP allow you the flexibility to incorporate those changes in service? And there may be quite fundamental ones of, instead of treating people in single rooms, you treat people in multiple wards, or you treat people in different ways. And does a PPP allow you that flexibility? And I think we've got to be very careful about the way you approach it, because one way the UK is you specify everything in advance, in which case you've cut all flexibility. Another way is to have some sort of arbitration agreement where if you need to change things in the future, you can actually change it. I'll give you one tiny example from a health service in the UK, is that they forgot to put in the contract that twice a year the clocks change. And they wanted, for the life of the contract, they wanted £50,000, so 55,000 euros for the life of the contract, to change the clocks twice a year, because it was not written in the contract. And that shows you the format of the way you do it, as well as not properly consulting. But I can maybe talk to you about it later.
Thank you, Ronald. If there are no very urgent questions, I would like to move on to my next speaker. And we're shifting now from a more abstract considerations for PPP frameworks to a country approach. And I'm very happy to welcome Professor Danilo de Oliveira Sampaio from the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in Brazil. I hope it wasn't too bad. Yeah, thank you. And who will share details on public-private partnerships and their relationship with sustainable development in Brazil. Danilo will elaborate on public-private partnerships as a possibility for sustainable development for the improvement of the Brazilian society in the infrastructure and health sector. I will skip the introduction. Please introduce yourself if you want, but I think according to the time, if that's okay for the speakers, I will keep it short. Danilo.
Thank you, Dr. Susann. Ladies and gentlemen, Richards, good morning. It's a pleasure to me to stay here in UN in the West. I'd like to present to you some words in this slide, looking to the figure and the 17 goal. It's involved the other goals, because without partnership it's impossible to make other goals. That's the figure. And that's the next slide. UN Goal 17. Revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. The first paragraph, as successful sustainable development agenda requires partnership between governments, the private sector, and the civil society. And the objective of this article, you can see the objective of this research was to verify the model of private-public partnership in Brazil specifically, and their relationship with sustainable development, to point out cases and present critics evaluating positive aspects and point out possibilities for improvements. In this slide, the next paragraph, I'm stack. The support of the planet today is in line with the sustainability of the business. There is no way one does not depend on the other. The last paragraph, PublicPrivate Partnership bring together organizations, companies, and government in favor of sustainable development, and therefore can together promote and make projects. Okay, thank you. Thank you. And I prefer the next one because it's very important to make the literature review. And let's see the mutual gain, okay? Two main aspects. What is the public-private partnership? You can see the legal aspect. It's very important, involve the specific legislation of each country. And management aspects involve the results, either related to the state of companies and organizations. It's very important because everybody needs to think about the mutual gain, okay? And I can see, especially in theory, PPPs emerge as a public management option in UK, more specifically in the Margaret Thatcher government. Its influence in other countries include Brazil. Brazil was one of these countries influenced, however, the partnership in the country began too late in Brazil. And we have 9 types of risks factors in PPP. How can I say? Technical risk, that's first. Constructural risk, second. Operational risk. Revenue risk, financial risk, risk of force measure, regulatory political risk, environmental risk, the full risks. In case of Brazil, I'd stack the number 3, operational risk, number 5, financial risk, number 7, regulatory political risk, and 9, the full risk. It's a problem to need improve in Brazil. Continue literature review. I can see the last paragraph. This fact culminated in the creation of the National Privatization Plan during the core government. By law, this establishment rules the concessions and permissions of public service of private companies. In Brazil, start on way and permissions of public service of private companies. And before, you can see 3 options to make it PPP in Brazil, especially concessions, privatizations, and this article, I'm talking about PPPs. And finally, it's a literature review. You can see 5 points. It's very, very important to make SD. Social point, it's a fundamental. Environmental point, territorial point, economic point. In the case of Brazil, politics point. I can read, democracy is a fundamental value and a necessary tool to make things happen. The point is very important in Brazil. Now, I put the case in Brazil. In literature review, in social terms, Brazil, we have a good news. Literacy rate in Brazil, which was 91.5% in 2030, was 9.4% in 2015. The target for 2014 is to have 10% in Brazilian population begin literature. You can see the malnutrition in children under 5 years of age declined 18.4% between 1974 and 1975 to 2.18% between 2008 to 2009. It's a good news for social in Brazil. In the environment terms in Brazil, it's 2 good news. Looking at the Code of Project Monitoring Deforestation in the legal Amazon by satellite in last year, without Brazilian Amazon, a region that involves 9 states, only one was recorded as being high deforestation. Between August 2016 and July 2017, the amount of deforested area corresponded to less than 1% of the total region. And I need to go. The methodology of this article and data analysis. This research is documentary and bibliographic purpose. You can see the PPPs in Brazil, federal government projects, 15 projects, the federal government, urban mobility subnational projects, 6 projects in Brazil, and the states and the capital projects, private capital projects, 148. You can see the data analysis according to World Bank database released in 2017 based on 115 in the middle income development countries. It has been reported that Brazil and India account for 55% of private participation in infrastructure investments. Brazil owns 87% of total investments in Latin American and Caribbean region, World Bank. Between 2004 and 2010, PPPs in Brazil obtained a great presence in international companies, 16% of case, then the domestic company, 14% of case. Let's go. This is a slide for data analysis. This the projects according by Ministry of Planning, Development and Management in Brazil. There have 15 federal projects carrying out in Brazil. For example, irrigation point, that's very important. You can see Brazilian geostatory satellite, that's very important. Data center complex, the order. Other data analysis. Now, not so bad notice. On the other hand, state projects are greater in number, totaling 148 in the different sectors, such highways, schools, hospitals, and football stadiums, and sports complexes, hotels, and others. There is 6 subnational projects for urban mobility, for example, São Paulo, Curitiba, Salvador, Porto Alegre, Rio de Janeiro, and VLT, especially in Rio de Janeiro. But one of the main problems of PPP projects in Brazil is the slowness and bureaucracy of the process, as well as efficient control of regulation. Of these regions, the Public Ministry has audited and found management programs which further delay the execution of works. It's a problem. In Brazil, several PPPs projects were interrupted by the Public Prosecutor's Office due to the slow execution of the works and the financing and the irregularities found through the projects. In Brazil model, PPPs do not have good control by the government of the rural partnerships. This can leave a disgrace in the quality of the works carried out, as well as corrupt system that may favor some contractors who have recently been accused by the Public Prosecutor's Office of corruption, public management. That's the last one, okay? I give here suggestions about this secondary research. In development, PPP's policies, the Brazilian government must be rigorous in place eating in projects that include the triple SD or triple bottom line, profit, people, and planet, during and after the project ends. It should become a formal requirement to enforce the obligations of the executing companies on the economic benefits to local population, where the work be carried out with respect to environmental laws and social development. 2, a monitor for each of the project by designated team should carry out, we should check whether the company is complying with both the correct execution of the schedule and applies the triple SD. In the project, make the management of risks arising from PPP in order to safeguard public money clear. 4, to take account of state for dependence in private companies in the execution of public work without the criteria of control and regulation, which may provoke inefficiently and disregard the sovereignty of the Federation Constitution. A law is required and regulates the democracy state of law in Brazil. And finally, it's recommended to train and instruct the new generation of public and private manager by training them the concept of FD application, as well to demand transparency and administrative ethical efficiency of public agents involved PPP in Brazil. Gentlemen and Madam Richards, I believe in peace and a partnership between the countries. I believe in sustainable development, but I believe in the justice and the democracy in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danilo, for illustrating how PPPs have contributed to increase the life standard of the people in Brazil and how problems of controlling should be tackled and must be tackled in the country. I think we have time for 2 questions. Anyone has questions with regard to Brazil or controlling of PPPs? No one? Okay. Thank you, Danilo, again. I'm very happy now to introduce Professor Beverlee Anderson from the California State University from the US. And she will now shift the focus of this session towards the question of how can NGOs improve the execution of PPPs by contributing to the selection process of potential partners. We have heard Ronald has mentioned opportunities of NGO and target group involvement already, and I think Beverlee will elaborate on this a bit more. Thank you, Beverlee. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I would really like to say I'm probably taking more away from this conference that I'm going to be giving in my short speech today, because I have learned so much in the past 2.5 days. It's just been amazing. I think I'm really pleased with the conference because I have learned a lot from all sorts of different perspectives, government, NGOs, and private businesses. This paper is about looking at the stakeholders where private businesses have and how they can really help inform the success or, in some cases, the failure of a public-private partnership. I would like to recognize my co-author on this, who is not here, Catalin Ratul, and he and I have been working on sustainability issues for several years, and I would like to recognize him for this work. Our focus, of course, is on SDG 17, and I'm going to skip through the first slides because in the past 2.5 days we've heard all the wonderful things about PPPs. I'm going to skip to some concerns there are. First of all, these are from the literature as much as anything else. Sometimes there's unclear responsibilities. People aren't sure who's supposed to do what. Even when you write things out, who is supposed to change those clocks in London or in Great Britain when they have the health situation going along? Sometimes there's a poor alignment with the strategies. The purpose of the NGO or the government agency may not align well with the strategy of the business organization. Sometimes it's inefficient optimization. Businesses frequently treat social issues and PPOs as something that are stepchildren to their actual running a business. And sometimes they're put aside and they aren't given the attention that they should, which sometimes results in lack of optimization. There's also a lack of discipline in execution. And one of the things that is very interesting is many times it's the top people of the organization that sign these PPPs. But you find it's the people down in the organization who actually have to do and perform the functions. And sometimes they aren't clear about what it is they're supposed to do. Sometimes there is a lack of ownership. Is this what I'm really paid to do? Sometimes we have poor project controls because as stepchildren, they aren't given the attention as far as controls and assessment that other projects are. And sometimes the businesses think that the cost is going to be much lower than it actually turns out to be. And this causes some problems in the PPP. And you also have poor resource optimization. Sometimes they haven't really matched. What are the strengths of the organization that can best be matched with the NGO or the government agency? So those are some of the concerns that we were looked at. And we were looking at how stakeholders, there are several successes, and I'm just skipping through those. Stakeholders can really influence how successful or unsuccessful a partnership happens to be. And we are going to look at only 3 of the stakeholders today: the customers, the investors, and the employees. Now, there are other stakeholders that are also should be considered, but these are 3 of the most prominent ones. Excuse me. Customers. One of the things that we find is today with social media and all of the things going on, customers are very apt to voice complaints when they're unhappy. We have in the United States, some organizations have been supporting of Planned Parenthood. There has been huge backlash and also boycotts of firms that are supporting Planned Parenthood because not all of the customers are aligned with that particular goal. And this then in social media has gone wild, and they've tried to get boycotts going on. So one of the things that you find that not all of the customers are going to be happy with the business firm engaging with different agencies. Maybe for some of the goals it works, for others it doesn't. One of the things we found in a Harris survey done in the United States says that there was a 10% decrease in concern for the planet from 2009. And this is one of the things that you find is interesting. It's even though some people are very concerned about the triple bottom line, not everyone is. And so therefore, one of the things you find is what do the customers feel about these different issues? There are green consumers, and I find this very interesting. Some people are really into the environment and will be happy to pay, such as if you buy Tom's shoes. Are you all familiar with Tom's shoes, where they sell one pair and then they give one pair of shoes to different places free of charge? When people buy shoes from Tom's, they know exactly what they're doing. They are going to give extra money so that this company can give shoes away for free. But there are other types of consumers that are very cost conscious and will only buy things that are environmentally focused if the cost is lower. And then you have the eco-chics, as we're referred to, and these will only buy green products if it's a conspicuous consumption, if they can go around and show people that I am a green consumer. If they can't show it, they aren't going to go along with it. So one of the things that you have as a challenge is identify what are the consumers of the firms, what are their priorities? And one of the things, if you're going to approach a business firm, you better be aware of what their customers, how their customers feel, because they are a big stakeholder and can influence the success of it. And of course, the best thing to do is for an NGO to identify organizations where the customers' priorities align with their own priorities. We also have investors. And we heard yesterday, did you really need to make a profit? Well, I think most investors think so. The reason why they are investing, they do want some return on their investment as well as doing good. And this is one of the things that you find with investors. The goal is many of them want to invest in social responsible organizations. This is one of the things that the first speaker today was talking about customers. Why did they support this organization, which wasn't very socially responsible? A question is, why are people investing in this firm if they aren't socially responsible? And one of the things that you find that a lot of firms now have funds that are SRI, socially responsible investment fundamentals. And in the U.S., it's around $9 trillion are now invested in these types of funds. And one of the things that we find is, for the most part, investing in good causes also brings good rewards. And this is one of the things that you find, that the yields are many times higher than they are in other investments. And we will skip about the risk. We've talked about risk before. I did want to spotlight one organization, UBS, and I take the 8 up here from my hotel, and we passed their office building. And this is an organization which is really a partner as far as the strategic sustainability goals go. And if you look at this, you can read the thing. They really say that they are trying to invest in ways which will really help the world, society as a whole. And if the quote is, we've partnered with visionaries who've developed innovative ways to meet the UN's SDGs while also generating financial returns for their investors. And that was in 2017. So the investors' challenge is to find, again, goals of organizations which match with the goals of the investors. Okay, why people work? The employees. Of course, people work to get paid. That's the main reason people hold a job. But why people work where they do is for other reasons. Many times you find, and the last one listed here is meaningful work that makes a difference. What we find is that many times employees work where they do because they feel they're going to make a contribution to society as well as get an income. And one of the things that we find, and this slide goes through the different baby boomers and the Generation Xers and the millennials, and we have hope. The millennials, nearly half believe their employees should engage with issues important to society. And one of the things that we find, selection of partners is very, very critical. When you look at this, this is the final slide, is customers, investors, and employees really impact the firm. And anytime an NGO is trying to develop a partnership, they have to be aware of who the customers are, who the investors are, and who the employees are. And that concludes.
Thank you very much, Beverlee, for demonstrating how the inclusion of stakeholders can enhance the efficiency and the success for public-private partnerships. And here we have a recurring theme, which is the common good and doing something that's meaningful. I think that's everything, that's all the theme that brings us together here today. I would like to start the Q&A session. I think we have another, let's say, 10 minutes to discuss a few of the issues that were raised here, and I asked the audience to ask some questions. Are there no? Oh, yes, please.
I'd like to go back to the health issue, and not in the treatment side. I'm a consultant in public health, so I'm asking about the effectiveness of private-public partnerships in the prevention agenda and in the holistic approach or the holistic definition of health.
It's a question for Ronald? Yes.
Oh dear.
Okay.
That's a very hard question. Now, public health, my engagement with public health is actually through employment for people who have got disabilities or people who have got older people, actually. I'm currently involved, actually, in a project with some public health doctors who, in Scotland, looking at older workers who have, some of whom have disabilities, and trying to get back into work. But that is maybe not quite, you're probably thinking of more mainstream health, but this does show you where public-private partnerships are important, because you've got an employment issue, which you could say, well, that's about economists, etc. And then you've got a health issue, and the two do not normally come together. And I would say that generally we've been very bad at that. If you look at most employment policies, well, the public health people tell me that one of the biggest things to promote your health when you're older is to be actually in employment. To lose your job is very bad for your health. Involuntary, not talking about retirement or voluntary retirement, but involuntary retirement, involuntary layoffs, etc., very bad for your health. And therefore, both mental health and physical health, but particularly mental health. So if we're trying to see work as a potential medical or public health issue rather than purely as getting people back into the labour market, there's quite a strong argument in favour of that. We should actually be helping people get back into meaningful work because it will improve their health. But in that case, you've got a public-private partnership where you've got to have health specialists who often would be using things like cognitive behaviour therapy, etc., to help change people's attitudes if they've had a lot of failure at finding work in the past, have been out of work for a long time, they lack confidence, etc. So in one of the many schemes, the Pathways to Work schemes in the UK, they brought in health professionals, which were people like physios, occupational therapists, etc., who had very great skills in things like cognitive behaviour therapy, to actually work with unemployed people to give them the confidence, etc., to try. Then in parallel and in partnership with that was the employment specialists who were helping them with their CVs, with their technical training, etc. And that actually seemed to work quite well. And in the pilots, it worked. The number of people going back into work was much higher than the control groups, and that was very good. The problem, and that's, I think, a very good example of where you got a public-private partnership where you actually got, private companies, employment specialists, together with health specialists, together with the actual employers, the companies that would employ these people directly, and also with the public sector who are providing welfare and unemployment payments to the individuals and funded the whole scheme. And that seemed to work very well. The problem then came when you mainstreamed it. And this often comes with public policies. And if you mainstream a public-private partnership from a pilot, what happened, I think is very common, is you take out the really valuable bit, because that's the expensive bit. So which bit you take out? Well, the health specialists are really quite expensive. But if you take them out and replace them with sort of somebody who's just trained in a few weeks to do that service, then is that okay? Well, the answer is not okay, because part of the reason is the person receiving the health intervention, the cognitive behaviour therapy or whatever, actually trusted the medical professional to give them the best medical advice. When that was replaced by almost an employment specialist who was just trained up in that area, they thought, wait, no, this person is trying to get me into any job, into work, and if we had that breakdown of trust between the clinical provider and the client, who was a person looking for a job. So I think in that case what they did was they cut out the expensive bit, but when they mainstreamed the public-private partnership, and they actually in so doing, they damaged it dramatically, and the effectiveness was much lower. So it's a roundabout way of saying it, but I think in many areas of public health, we need to look at it. It's not just about immunization and etc., but really in other bits. But the danger is that when this program is mainstreamed through a competitive PPP, you can often get the really valuable bit cut out, and the real valuable bit is not simply somebody being able to do that little bit of health intervention. It's also the way that the client perceives that person to be an independent health specialist who is on my side, versus a non-independent employee of the employment service who only get paid if I get into a job and therefore are going to push me into any job. So a roundabout way of answering the question.
Thank you very much, Ronald. Any more questions? Yes, please, sir.
The question is to Dr. Bhabani. Perhaps it's not the market forces that are at fault. The market has a role to play, and I guess I would propose and then see what your take on that. Perhaps it's the value system that govern the market forces is the issue here. If the market forces is itself the ultimate judge, if you will, yes, I think things can go wrong and probably have gone wrong. So my proposition is market forces by themselves are not really the problem. It's what govern the market forces that will ultimately decide success or failure. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a wonderful intervention. I'll start answering your question by telling a small story from United States of America. American women never smoke tobacco before 1920s. You know, many people smoked, but it was not a mainstream smoking culture. So the tobacco companies employed a philosopher called Edward Bernays, who is the nephew of Sigmund Freud, to start propaganda, public relations office for tobacco corporations in US. And that led to the growth of, they combined smoking with empowerment of women. So that led to the expansion of tobacco market among university students and college-going students in America. I'm not doing a value judgment that men can smoke and women cannot smoke. If men can smoke and lose their lungs, women can smoke, lose their lungs. I have no issues. But the market forces, those who laid this creation of a new desire for the women's empowerment through the symbolization of tobacco smoking, the market forces bring their own ideas, own cultures. There's a culture of consumption and there is a consumer culture. Culture of consumption is local. You know, Scottish people eat different types of food from the Indian people. Sudanese eat different types of food than, rest of Africa. So we have different cultures of consumption, which is diverse. But the culture of consumer culture is a mass-produced ideology by the market forces to solve the internal contradictions of capitalist market, those who produce more than we can ever use them. So how do you sell them in the market? You create a new desire-based society. Do I need iPhone 10? No, I don't need. Do I desire for one? Yes, I do. So it's an ideological, market forces come with their own culture, they come with their own ideology. So what we need to do, we're not here to dismantle market forces. I'm not here to dismantle business. We need market. We need to bring back the social character of market. We need to bring back the social character of business. That's what my approach would be. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhabani. If there are there any urgent questions? Because otherwise I would conclude the session, taking into account that lunch is being served very soon. So I will thank my panelists very much for these very interesting contribution, and I think they provided the basis for further discussions on the frameworks of PPPs, of the inclusion of the common good, of stakeholder mapping approaches, which are probably not taken into consideration enough when PPPs are designed. So there are a lot of things we just have to keep in mind. Not all PPPs are the same. They differ a lot in terms of approaches, stakeholders, region, and they are complex undertakings. So I'm looking forward to continue this discussion in the afternoon, and I wish you a nice lunch break. Thank you very much.
So please remember, if we all help and do a little bit, it will make a big difference.